And now it's time to photosynthesize this week's
biggest bugger emitter!
And this week it goes to the American Lung Association for their position on nicotine pouches. Not patches, pouches. What is a nicotine pouch, you ask? I asked the same thing. I don't use nicotine at all, so it was a new one on me. They're these tiny cylindrical pouches that are just big enough to hold between your cheek and gum. Sorta like chew, but not. There's no tobacco leaf or stem or anything, just nicotine. That nicotine could be derived from tobacco, or it could be completely synthetic. The nicotine enters the bloodstream through the mucous membranes in the gums. There's no spitting, everything stays inside the pouch, and it's disposed of when used. Well, our story is another one that comes from Michael Siegel, who writes the Tobacco Analysis blog. He's an anti-smoking advocate who was one of the witnesses in the 1994 case Engel v. Liggett, a Florida suit against Big Tobacco that yielded smokers and their families $145 billion in punitive damages. The reason why was that the tobacco companies had lied about the effects of their products. They knew cigarettes were addictive and caused serious diseases and concealed or misrepresented those risks. Quick footnote so we don't digress too far. The Florida Supreme Court threw out the damages, saying that plaintiffs' conditions were too individualized for a class action. Sort of like I've been pointing out recently about class action copyright infringement cases. But instead of making every plaintiff start from scratch, they allowed the jury's Phase 1 findings to stand, allowing the difficult and critical causation findings to apply so they won't have to be litigated again. At any rate, back to the story. Now, the American Lung Association is complaining that the tobacco companies are telling the truth. You see, as confirmed by the FDA, using nicotine pouches instead of cigarettes, quote, puts you at a lower risk of mouth cancer, heart disease, lung cancer, stroke, emphysema, and chronic bronchitis. The FDA found that the pouches, in particular a product called Zen, quote, as actually used by consumers, would significantly reduce harm and the risk of tobacco-related disease to individual tobacco users and benefit the health of the population as a whole, taking into account both users of tobacco products and persons who do not currently use tobacco products. And the American Lung Association hit the ceiling, calling this, quote, appalling, and saying, quote, the Lung Association calls on the FDA to reverse this action. We must protect our children from a lifelong addiction to nicotine. Wow, went straight to, think of the children! That escalated quickly. But the pouches do pose a lower risk of cancer, COPD, and these other diseases. What good do they think it will do to deny people this information? Because they don't actually care about your lungs. They're prohibitionists, not healthcare professionals. Siegel wrote, what's actually appalling is that the American Lung Association would prefer that Swedish Match not be allowed to tell consumers that nicotine pouches are much safer than cigarette smoking. You would think that an organization devoted to preventing lung disease would want smokers to know that if they quit by switching to nicotine pouches, they will lower their risk for lung cancer and chronic lung disease. But for some reason, the American Lung Association is actually lobbying to get the FDA to forbid Swedish Match from telling consumers the truth. For example, one of the many testimonials the FDA received said, quote, I was a smoker for 10 years and a snuff since 1983. I found myself unable to quit tobacco for more than a few weeks at best. I switched to Zen a year ago, and it has been game-changing. To be blunt, I still get my nicotine, but not the cancer. It's fairly ludicrous to point at the risk of teenagers getting hooked on Zen as a risk factor, literally throwing out a valuable baby with the proverbial bathwater. This product is absolutely life-changer for the long-term nicotine junkie like myself. Siegel wrote, this is a great public disservice. It could potentially result in deaths that could otherwise have been prevented. After all, if reversing this FDA decision results in smokers not believing there is any health advantage to switching to nicotine pouches, then why should they bother switching? Might as well get the full enjoyment of your Marlboros if the tobacco-free, combustion-free alternative is no safer. In a statement to the FDA, the New Jersey Policy Institute said, quote, "When adults are not provided with clear, evidence-based information, they often assume that all nicotine products carry comparable harms. That misperception can discourage individuals who are actively trying to choose products that expose them to fewer toxicants than cigarettes." Siegel, as usual, pulled no punches, quote, "In public health, we have a code of ethics, and that code makes it clear that honesty and transparency are important core values. The principle of health communication should be to tell the truth. The ends do not justify the means. It is not ethical for us to achieve a public health aim by lying to the public." The FDA concluded that Zyn poses no significant risk of lung cancer. Actually, when you look at the science, there's no evidence it increases your cancer risk at all. Siegel concluded, "I find it appalling that the American Lung Association finds it appalling that the FDA is allowing Swedish Match to tell consumers the truth about the relative health risks of Zyn compared to combustible cigarettes. Reversing this decision would essentially force the company to lie to the public and to hide the single most important fact about the product that consumers need to know. Why in the world would we want Swedish Match to market Zyn as just another dangerous tobacco product for recreational use, rather than encourage smokers to switch to Zyn to save their lives?" Right on! I don't think anything more needs to be added to that, except, of course, that it makes the American Lung Association this week's biggest bogon emitter.